The fog didn't just hide the battlefield that morning, it erased it. September 19, 1944, Arracourt, Lorraine, France. 0730 hours. A cold, wet blanket of fog hangs over the rolling farmland, so thick you can taste it. To the men of the 113th Panzer Brigade, it feels like protection, a grey curtain between them and American artillery, between them and prowling Yarbos overhead. Inside the cupola of his Panther, Oberleutnant Karl Hoffmann can barely see the antenna on the tank behind him. His world is a small steel ring of vision blocks, each one filled with the same flat, milky white. The engine growls at low RPM, treads clatter softly, and somewhere out in the mist, 41 other Panthers grind forward in single file. This is supposed to be the easy part. For months, German propaganda has told these crews the same story. American tanks are clumsy, lightly trained crews, thin armor, inferior optics, quantity over quality. The Panther, they've been told, is the answer to all that. Sloped armor that shrugs off 75mm shells, a high-velocity gun that can punch through a Sherman at well over 2,000 meters. On paper, this brigade marching toward Arracourt is a sledgehammer. The Americans ahead of them? Just another piece of soft metal waiting to be reshaped. But paper doesn't account for fog. Hoffmann leans forward, gloved hands resting on the rim of the cupola, eyes straining. The world is reduced to sound, the rattle of track pins, the whine of final drives, the occasional muffled call over intercom. No birds, no aircraft, no artillery, just the heavy breathing of Panthers pushing blindly through damp fields toward an enemy they cannot see. "Keep 5 kilometers per hour," Hoffmann reminds his driver over the throat mic, his voice calm, almost bored. There is no need to rush. Once they break through this screen of American armor, the road behind the front is open. Fuel dumps, artillery parks, headquarters, soft targets. Somewhere out in that fog, American tankers are sitting in their squat Shermans, he thinks, terrified, engines idling, waiting to be slaughtered. He never considers, not even for a moment, that someone on the other side has written a very different script for this morning. Ahead of the advancing Panthers, beyond the reach of German optics, 4 silhouettes sit motionless in shallow, hull-down positions along a low hedgerow. Engines already warm, radios whispering, turrets pointed not straight ahead, but slightly off to the flanks. They are smaller than Panthers, lower, open-topped. Their armor is so thin it can be pierced by heavy machine gun fire. But they are not here to trade blows. They are M18 Hellcats of Lieutenant Edwin Leeper's platoon, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. And unlike the German crews creeping forward in the fog, these men know exactly what they're waiting for. The Hellcat's right R975 radial engine chatters at a lazy idle, concealed under its thin armor plates. The driver's hands rest lightly on the steering levers. The gunner's eye is pressed into the rubber cup of the sight. The loader keeps one hand on the rim of the open turret, the other resting on the next 76mm round. They can't see the Panthers any more clearly than the Panthers can see them, but they don't need to. American forward observers have already plotted likely approach routes. Artillery has probed the fog earlier, listening for the echo of armor. Now, every man in this platoon is waiting for the first shadow to step into the killing ground. The moment comes without warning. Through the milky haze, no more than 30 meters away, Hoffmann catches a flicker of movement off his right front. A dark shape, low, flat. Not big enough to be a Sherman, he thinks, confusion flickering for half a heartbeat. Before that thought can even form into a word, a muzzle flash blooms inside the fog, a deafening crack, a shock through the Panther's hull. The tank to Hoffmann's left, number 232, lurches as if kicked by a giant. A jet of flame and black smoke erupts from the seam where its turret meets the hull. The vehicle shudders, stutters, then stops. Flames licking out across the engine deck. "Find Panzer, right side!" Hoffman snaps, instinct kicking in. "Traverse right! Schnell, schnell!" But his gunner is already fighting the machine. The Panther's massive 7-ton turret begins to turn, hydraulics whining as it grinds toward the phantom threat. In this kind of fog, every degree feels like an eternity. Out in the mist, Lieper's Hellcat is no longer there. The driver has slammed the transmission into gear at the gunner's shout of, "On the way!" As the shell leaves the barrel, the M18 is already accelerating, the radial engine roaring from a mutter to a scream. From a dead stop to 30 miles per hour in seconds, the light chassis almost leaping forward over the uneven French soil. By the time Hoffman's gun reaches the spot where the muzzle flash came from, there is nothing in his sight picture but empty fog. Hoffman's pulse spikes. This is wrong. Enemy tanks don't move like that. Shermans lumber. They do not sprint. Another flash, this time farther out on his right flank. He pivots instinctively, but the round isn't meant for him. Panther 234, somewhere out in the blur, takes a hit through the thinner side armour. There is no warning, just a dull thud, followed by a blossom of orange through the fog as ready-rack ammunition cooks off. 2 Panthers gone. Hoffman still hasn't even seen the enemy clearly. On the American side, voices overlap calmly over the radio net. "Cobra 2, this is Cobra 1. Target burning, shifting right. Cobra 3, copy, moving to second firing position. Cobra 4, covering, watch your spacing." Each Hellcat is working through a practiced choreography. Fire, relocate, flank, fire again. The fog that seemed like a German ally is now a weapon in American hands. It hides their movement, it shortens engagement ranges, it neutralizes the Panther's long-range gun advantage and turns Arracourt into a knife fight. Exactly the kind of fight a fast, lightly armoured tank destroyer can turn to its advantage. Hoffman finally catches a real glimpse. For a fraction of a second, as his Panther crests a slight rise, the fog thins. On his right front, maybe 200 metres away, a small tracked vehicle bursts from behind a hedgerow at full speed, suspension flexing, open turret visible. It is wrong in every way his training has prepared him for. The silhouette is too low, the hull is too narrow, the turret is too light. The machine gunner on the Panther's roof instinctively opens fire, tracers stitching through the mist, but rounds bounce harmlessly off the fleeing shape. The stranger doesn't even try to trade shots. It swerves hard left, throwing mud from its tracks, disappearing back into the grey. "Was ist das?" someone breathes over the intercom. What is that? Hoffman doesn't know. Neither does his brigade commander. Neither does any German tanker on this front. But they are about to learn the name. M18 Hellcat. On the American side of the line, Lieper's platoon executes the next step in the plan. Those initial shots were not meant to annihilate the entire column. They were meant to break its cohesion, to shock it, to force the Panthers to stop and orient. Now the real work begins. "Cobra 1, relocate to phase line Bravo," Lieper orders, voice tight but controlled. "Cobra 2, swing wide left. We're going for their sides." The Hellcats fan out, using shallow draws and hedgerows as cover. Where a Panther would crawl and groan, worried about throwing a track, the M18s simply fly. 40 miles per hour across ploughed fields that turn heavy German tanks into floundering beasts. Back in the Panther, Hoffman orders his driver to halt. Charging blindly into this fog now feels suicidal. He's not alone. Across the brigade, other commanders are doing the same. Some shout for artillery support that cannot see them. Others demand reconnaissance that doesn't exist. One by one, the Panthers become static shapes in the mist, exactly what the Hellcat crews are counting on. From a new position on the German flank, Lieper's gunner steadies his sight on a faint, darker rectangle in the fog. He can't see details. He doesn't need to. The height, the width, the outline of the gun, everything says Panther. "On the way," he calls. The Hellcat bucks. The 76mm armor-piercing round crosses the short distance in a heartbeat and slams into the Panther's side armor, where the designers at MAN never expected to be hit. Inside the German tank, the impact is apocalyptic. Spall erupts from the interior armor. Shards of white-hot steel scythe through the fighting compartment. One man dies without understanding why his world has suddenly turned into a furnace. From Hoffman's cupola, all he can see is another orange smear blooming somewhere off his right. 3 minutes have passed, not hours, not even half an hour of battle, just minutes. 3 Panthers burning, 2 more crippled. Somewhere out there in the fog, 4 small, thin-skinned vehicles are dancing circles around a brigade that once believed itself invincible. The net crackles with fragments of reports. "Fast enemy panzers, can't get the gun on him. Hit from the side, short range. They're gone before we can traverse." The language is different in each tank. German curses, half-shouted range estimates, snapped orders. But the emotion underneath is the same. Confusion, then disbelief, then the first sharp stab of fear. Hoffman realizes something that no training manual has prepared him to admit. He is not hunting inferior Shermans this morning. He is being hunted by something else. By the time the fog begins very slowly to thin, the damage is done. 5 Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade are burning wrecks scattered across unseen fields. 4 small American vehicles, almost untouched, are already slipping back to new positions, engines howling, turrets traversing, eyes searching for the next victim. In the official after-action reports, this hour around Arracourt will be recorded in numbers, kills, losses. A lopsided ratio that stuns German staff officers. But for the men inside the Panthers, the memory will always be simpler. A morning when the fog came alive, when enemy tanks appeared out of nowhere, struck with impossible speed, and vanished before a German gunner could even finish turning his turret. On September 19, 1944, in a farmer's field near Arracourt, the German Panzerwaffe learned a hard new truth. Fortress tanks could be outthought and outrun by a machine that looked more like a hot rod than a weapon of war. And the name of that machine was the M18 Hellcat. By the time the Hellcats were dancing through the fog at Arracourt, the real revolution had already happened, 3 years earlier, on drafting tables and test ranges an ocean away. Wind the clock back to late 1941. America has just been dragged into a global war. US officers study film of German panzers ripping through Europe, Poland, France, the Soviet Union, armored spearheads punching holes while everyone else scrambles to react. Most armies looking at that footage draw the same conclusion. We need bigger tanks, thicker armor, heavier guns. A handful of American officers see something different. At Fort Meade, Maryland, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce and the new Tank Destroyer Center are handed a simple but terrifying problem. What do you do when a German panzer division breaks through your front line and heads straight for your rear? You can't be everywhere with tanks. You can't build a wall of armor across an entire continent. Bruce's answer is as radical as it is simple. Don't try to stop the breakthrough. Chase it down and kill it. Not with more tanks, with something faster. Tank Destroyer doctrine is born on paper before anything like the M18 exists in steel. Its commandments are blunt. You don't wait on the line. You stay in reserve. You move faster than the enemy armor. You hit from the flank. You never stay in the same place long enough to be hit back. Speed, firepower, crew efficiency. Armor comes dead last. In the Wehrmacht, such an idea would have been heresy. German design lines are all trending in one direction: heavier. Panzer III to Panzer IV, Panther to Tiger. Each new model adds tons and millimeters. In the United States, the Ordnance Department does something very American. It hands this unconventional idea to an unconventional designer. Not just to officers in olive drab, to car people. The contract for a new tank destroyer goes to Buick, part of General Motors. Inside Buick's design world sits a name completely out of place in a military spec sheet: Harley Earl, the man who invented the tail fin, the man who made American cars look fast even when they were parked. Earl's studio is told what the Army wants: a tracked vehicle that can keep up with or outrun anything on the battlefield. Use a Wright R975 radial aircraft engine, the same kind used in the M4 Sherman, but put it into something dramatically lighter. Give it a 76mm gun. Make it small enough to hide. Make it easy enough to build in thousands. The designers look at the usual tank trade-offs: armor, firepower, mobility, and start cheating at the equation. Armor? Strip it down. 1 inch on the front at best. Enough to stop rifle rounds and shell fragments, but nothing more. No heavy turret armor, no thick slabs. Weight drops. Weight down means something else can go up. Mobility. The Wright R975, a 9-cylinder radial pumping out 350 to 400 horsepower, moves a 33-ton Sherman at respectable speeds. Put that same engine in a 20-ton chassis, and suddenly you're not designing a tank anymore. You're designing a hot rod. Underneath, the engineers reject the old, clattering leaf springs and complex interleaved road wheels that make German tanks ride like farm machinery. Instead, they bolt in torsion bar suspension, long steel bars acting as springs, each road wheel riding its own smooth arc. At 10 miles per hour, the difference is subtle. At 40 or 50, it's everything. A Panther trying to sprint across rough ground bucks and shudders, its interleaved wheels choked with mud, every bump threatening to throw a track. An M18 Hellcat glides over the same terrain like a speedboat over chop. Still rough, still dangerous, but controllable. On a test track in the States, drivers push the prototype, first designated T70 gun motor carriage, harder and harder, 40 miles per hour, then 50. On a straight, paved run, with a brave man behind the controls and nothing to hit, the needle creeps up towards 60 miles per hour. 60. For a tracked vehicle in 1943, that number borders on insanity. But speed by itself isn't enough. You can't just drive fast. You have to shoot fast. Here, another design decision quietly changes the way battles will play out. Inside a German Panther, the turret is a massive armoured drum, a 7-ton assembly of thick steel and heavy gun. Hydraulics can swing it, but not quickly. On paper, full 360-degree traverse in about a minute. In practice, under combat RPM with the engine throttled down, it's slower. To chase a target from left to right, the gunner fights mass at every degree. In the Hellcat, the turret is more like the top of a sports car than the roof of a bunker. Thin armour, open top. The entire assembly weighs just over 2 tons. A dedicated power traverse system whips it around with far less effort. If that fails, a strong loader can man-crank it in an emergency. The difference isn't just mechanical, it's temporal. In the time it takes a Panther gunner to drag his massive turret across a foggy field toward a fleeting target, a Hellcat crew can spot, traverse, fire, reverse out of danger, over and over. On a doctrine chart, these numbers are just statistics. In Arracourt's fog, they become the difference between living long enough to fire a second shot or not. By mid-1943, the prototype has proved itself enough to earn a formal name, Tank Destroyer M18. Nickname, fitting, informal, and entirely unofficial at first, Hellcat. Production ramps up in Buick's Flint, Michigan plant. The same assembly lines and techniques that once turned out cars now spit out fast, low, lethal machines at automotive speed. Standardized components, bolt-on parts, engines that can be rolled out on rails and swapped in hours, not days. German factories, under bombing and resource shortages, are hand-assembling Panthers and Tigers like mechanical jewelry. American workers are cranking out Hellcats like Chevrolets. But before Arracourt, before the fog, the M18 has to prove that this hot rod philosophy actually works where it counts, in combat. Its debut comes in a place that seems almost designed to sabotage the entire idea, Italy. Spring 1944, Anzio beachhead. The terrain is wrong for a race car. Narrow roads, steep hills, towns clinging to ridges, mud, rock and sudden ambushes, not wide-open plains. 5 early T-70s are handed to the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Crews accustomed to the older, slower M10 now have something entirely different under them. The first impression is universal. This thing is fast. They learn quickly that speed cuts both ways. The open turret that keeps weight down also lets in cold rain, shrapnel, and the terrible, intimate violence of mortar fire. The thin armour means even a near miss can be lethal. In Italy, a Hellcat that blunders into the wrong valley or tries to play tank against a dug-in gun dies just as quickly as any other armoured vehicle. But even in that unsympathetic landscape, the basic concept shows flashes of brilliance. When German armour probes weak spots in the line, Hellcats can be there first. When infantry are pinned by a self-propelled gun around a bend, an M18 can sprint forward, fire, and vanish before the enemy can bring its weapon around. When a position is compromised, they don't crawl out, they launch. Reports trickle back, not dramatic headlines, fragments. Vehicle exhibits superior mobility. Engine accessible, field maintenance simplified. Effective when employed in accord with doctrine, hit and run, not line holding. The Army takes note. By the time the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion receives its Hellcats and ships to France, the rough edges of doctrine have been sanded down by experience. Officers drill into their crews a single, unforgiving truth. If you try to fight a Hellcat like a Sherman or a Panther, it will get you killed. If you fight it like what it really is, a hot rod with a high-velocity gun, you will kill things no one expects you to kill. In training grounds behind the lines, gunners practice traversing from target to target, exploiting that light turret. Drivers practice acceleration runs, learning how quickly they can go from cover to firing position and back. Commanders learn to think in arrows, not boxes. to imagine engagements not as fixed duels, but as looping, intersecting paths of movement. On German charts, the Panther stands as 45 tons of steel, with a top road speed of about 29 miles per hour under ideal conditions, far less off-road. On American charts, the Hellcat is barely 20 tons, capable of double that speed on good surfaces and maintaining terrifying pace even on rough ground. Heavier, slower, more armoured, less adaptable, lighter, faster, more fragile, more flexible. Two completely different answers to the same question. How do you kill an enemy tank? The Panther's answer: stand your ground and win the gunfight. The Hellcat's answer: don't be there when the enemy gun goes off. By the summer of 1944, by the time units like the 704th roll into Lorraine, this engineering philosophy has hardened into muscle memory. Drivers and gunners no longer think of speed as a luxury. They think of it as armor you can't see. At Anzio, the M18 had learned to survive in bad country. In France, it is about to discover what happens when the terrain finally matches the machine. Wide fields, rolling ground, and, on some mornings, a thick veil of fog that turns every engagement into a close-quarters knife fight. In that environment, all the work done in Buick studios and on American proving grounds stops being theory. The aircraft engine, the torsion bars, the light turret, the thin armor, the doctrine that says, go, shoot, move, don't stop. All of it comes together in a single brutal proof at Arracourt, where, for the first time, German Panther crews will find themselves outranged, not by guns, but by something they never truly factored into their equations: speed. September 20th, 1944. The fog over Arracourt hasn't vanished. It's changed. What was a solid white wall the day before is now a shifting, patchy veil. Pockets of clear air open and close across the rolling fields, revealing fragments of the battlefield, bits of hedgerow, a farmhouse, a sunken lane, then swallowing them again. For the 113th Panzer Brigade, that's a nightmare. For the Hellcat crews of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, it's an opportunity. They've had 24 hours to study this ground, to feel where the land rises and falls, where a hull can be safely hidden behind a knoll, and where a fast run between two stands of trees can carry them into a flanking position. The Panthers have numbers and armor. The Hellcats have a mental map. The doctrine drilled into them in training, shoot and scoot, isn't a slogan here. It's survival. A typical engagement on these September days doesn't begin with a dramatic charge. It starts with a report on the radio. Enemy armor, grid reference, a calm voice from a forward observer, or from a Sherman platoon acting as bait, calling in contact. Hellcats don't move as a mob. They move in small teams. One section, 2 M18s, takes up hull-down positions along a ridge or behind a low rise, only turrets and guns visible. Another section circles wide, engines throttled back to keep noise down, using folds in the ground to mask their movement. From a distance, if you could see the whole thing from above, it would look like a set of jaws closing. On the morning of the 20th, German Panthers push forward again, probing towards Arracourt and the vital road net beyond. They advance like they were trained, main guns forward, expecting the decisive fire to come from their front arc. The first shots prove them wrong. A pair of Hellcats, lying in wait on a slight reverse slope, let the lead Panthers roll into view not at long range, but at a few hundred yards, well inside the distance where their 76mm guns can punch through side armor. They hold fire until the German tanks are fully exposed, then engage almost simultaneously. 2 quick cracks. 2 Panthers stop, one burning, one spewing smoke. Before the rest of the German column can react, the Hellcats reverse back down the slope, disappearing completely. By the time the Panthers swing their turrets toward the ridge, there is nothing to shoot at. The second half of the Jaws, the flanking pair, has meanwhile sprinted across a low field, using their superior acceleration and torsion bar ride to traverse ground that would force a Panther to crawl. They pop up on the enemy's side, fire into the thinner flank armour of another tank, and dive away again. Shoot, scoot, repeat. One of the men orchestrating this deadly choreography is Sergeant Henry R. Hartman. Hartman is not a textbook hero. He's a professional. His crew knows their machine and trusts it. On September 20th, that trust turns into one of the most lopsided tank fights of the war. His platoon is covering a sector where German armour has already forced back American infantry. Visibility comes and goes in sheets of mist. Every time the fog lifts for a few minutes, Panthers appear, hunting for the guns that have been killing them from nowhere. Hartman positions his M18 in a shallow depression just behind a hedgerow, only the gun peaking above. He has pre-ranged the field in front of him. He knows the distances better than his enemy. A Panther emerges out of the grey, broadside to his position, focused on a distant Sherman. Hartman's gunner doesn't need to fumble with range tables. On the way! One shot into the side plate, just ahead of the turret. The German tank erupts. Hartman's driver is already throwing their Hellcat into reverse. Before the black smoke from the Panther's wreck has even thickened, the M18 has slid back behind cover, engine revving as they pivot toward a secondary firing point. Another call over the radio. More Panzers, north of the first kill. Hartman doesn't wait for orders. He sprints laterally along the backside of the ridge, pops up again at a slightly different angle, and finds another Panther presenting its flank while it tries to figure out who killed its comrade. Second round, second kill. Over the course of that day, Hartman repeats this pattern again and again, using every fold of ground, every hedgerow, every low ridge to change his angle while staying outside the narrow cone of German attention. By the end of the engagement, he and his crew are credited with 6 destroyed German tanks, most of them Panthers. Those 6 kills are not miracles. They are the direct consequence of design and doctrine working in harmony. The Hellcat's light turret means the gun is on target seconds after a new position is reached. The powerful radial engine and light chassis mean those new positions can be reached before the enemy even finishes traversing. The open turret, while dangerous, gives the commander and gunner unmatched situational awareness. They see Panthers first, and from angles the German crews are not expecting. On the German side, the psychological toll mounts rapidly. Panzer crews trained to fight set-piece duels find themselves paralyzed by uncertainty. If they advance too quickly, they risk exposing their flanks to unseen Hellcats. If they sit still to form a solid firing line, they become immobile targets for artillery and fast-moving tank destroyers. More and more often, the decision is made not to move at all. Reports from the German side after Arracourt mention unseen enemy tank destroyers of exceptional speed and warn against pursuit. Orders go out: do not chase these ghosts. Do not engage in mobile battle where they can dictate the terms. In effect, the Panther, a machine designed as an aggressive breakthrough tank, is being reduced to a static bunker by a lighter, cheaper opponent that refuses to stand and trade blows. The economics of the fight are as brutal as the tactics. Each Panther represents an enormous investment of scarce German resources, around 117,000 Reichsmarks and some 2,000 man-hours of skilled labour, plus high-grade steel, complex gearboxes, and a fragile final drive. Each M18 Hellcat costs roughly $57,500 to build, requiring far fewer hours on an assembly line built for mass production. At Arracourt, a vehicle that costs half as much is destroying its expensive rival at ratios of 5:10 to 1. For German crews who have survived the Eastern Front, the shock runs deeper than money. They grew up in a Wehrmacht where German armour was not just superior, it was psychologically invincible. T-34s and KVs could be beaten with tactics and superior optics. Shermans could be outgunned and out-armoured. Against the Hellcat, none of that feels true. You cannot outgun what you can rarely see. You cannot rely on armour when the enemy keeps finding your weak sides and rear. You cannot trust your turret to save you when, every time you begin to traverse toward a muzzle flash, the source has already moved. Crews begin to hesitate before pushing into patches of mist or cresting rises. They process every hedgerow, every wadi, every clump of trees as a potential launch pad for another fast-moving threat. That hesitation is exactly what the American doctrine is designed to create. By September 22nd, the pattern is brutal and clear. German Panthers roll forward, feel for contact, and take losses from unexpected directions. Hellcats engage, relocate, engage again. When pressure grows too great in one sector, they sprint, literally racing on roads and across fields to reinforce another threatened point. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalions after the Ardennes in December did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a graveyard waiting to be filled. Snow lay in thick, uneven sheets over the rolling Belgian countryside. Trees sagged under ice. Roads, those narrow, twisting village lanes that planners had once dismissed as unsuitable for major operations, were now the only arteries through which entire armies had to move. Into that frozen maze, in the early hours of December 16th, 1944, the German army hurled its last great gamble in the West. The Battle of the Bulge began with artillery and shock, but its engine was armour. Columns of Panthers, Panzer IVs and half-tracks pushed westward through the forests, aiming for the Meuse River and beyond. At their point, the 2nd Panzer Division, seasoned and still dangerous, driving hard toward the key crossroads town of Bastogne. The American lines, thin and surprised, bent under the weight. Units fell back, others were overrun. Maps in Corps headquarters, neatly coloured and marked the day before, now sprouted jagged arrows, pushing deep into what had been rear area yesterday. In that chaos, a small improvised force was told to do the one thing that mattered: get there first. Team de Sobry, named for its commander, Major William de Sobry, was a scratch blocking force built around elements of the 10th Armoured Division, Sherman tanks, armoured infantry, artillery support, and, crucially, a handful of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers. Their mission was simple to write and brutal to execute: race north from Bastogne to the village of Noville and hold, no matter who was coming. On a clear, dry day, that would have been a hard order. In the Ardennes winter, it bordered on insane. The roads were slick with packed snow and ice. Visibility came and went with the low clouds. Refugee columns, supply trucks, and retreating stragglers clogged intersections. Everything that could slow a tracked vehicle did, but the Hellcat was not a normal tracked vehicle. When the order came down, M18 drivers did what they had trained to do since Arracourt. They treated the road not as a cautious path, but as a racetrack with consequences. The same Wright R975 radial that had hurled them across muddy French fields now screamed in the frozen air, exhaust hanging in white plumes behind them. Gears shifted quickly through the torque converter transmission. Where Shermans and half-tracks gingerly felt their way around bends at 10 or 15 miles per hour, Hellcats pushed to double that whenever straight stretches allowed. Every additional mile per hour was additional time on the far end. Time to dig in, to reconnoitre, to turn a crossroads into a trap instead of a through route. Inside one of those M18s, the routine was anything but glamorous. The open turret that had been tolerable in Lorraine was now a wind tunnel of misery. Icy air knifed through the fighting compartment. Breath froze on scarves and goggles. Hands cramped on metal parts that stayed painfully cold no matter how often they were flexed. But the men put up with it, because the alternative was worse. Arriving second. As the column of Team Desaubry clawed its way north through the dark, the race was not just against the clock, but against an enemy they could not see. On parallel routes through neighbouring woods and villages, advance elements of the 2nd Panzer Division were also moving. Slower, heavier, but relentless. If those German spearheads reached Noville first, they would seize the high ground, control the road net, and roll on toward Bastogne before the Americans ever had a chance to anchor a defence. The battle for Noville, then, was decided hours before the first shot was fired. Decided by who could bend distance and time more effectively. Hellcats helped bend it. They reached the town ahead of the main body, engines roaring into the frozen square, then fanned out to key approaches. Some took up hull-down positions behind stone walls and low rises on the northern slopes. Others lurked near crossroads, where narrow streets funneled any attacker into predictable lines of approach. Snowbanks became impromptu revetments. Barns and hedgerows became camouflage. When the first German armoured elements probed toward Noville, they did not encounter a disorganized retreat or a half-prepared roadblock. They ran head-on into a coordinated defence, Shermans and infantry stiffened by fast-moving tank destroyers that had already surveyed fields of fire, pre-sighted lanes, and identified fallback positions. Getting there first had turned a village into an ambush. The initial contacts were brutal and close. German tanks, expecting to use the roads to push through, instead found themselves taking fire from unexpected angles. Hellcats that had sprinted ahead of the column now darted between covered positions on the outskirts, suddenly appearing at one intersection, firing, then vanishing behind the next row of houses. They used not open farmland this time, but urban dead ground, back gardens, alleys, dips in the terrain, to shift laterally faster than the heavier Panthers could reorient. Once again, the doctrine of shoot and scoot proved its worth, but now on a strategic scale. Every minute that the M18s and their supporting Shermans held Noville was a minute the 2nd Panzer Division was not advancing on Bastogne. Every German tank that had to halt, deploy and fight in the cold streets of a Belgian village was a tank not racing toward the Meuse. And race was the right word. On German maps, the offensive timetable was unforgiving. Distances between key objectives were matched to fuel calculations, ammunition stocks, and expected resistance. If spearheads reached certain points by certain hours, the Ardennes Gamble might succeed. Miss those timing windows, and the offensive began to bleed out. Speed wasn't just for outflanking in a local firefight anymore. It was a currency spent against the German schedule. Hellcats, with their notorious top speed, became emergency tools in that larger economy. Reports from the Bulge are filled with instances where M18 units were diverted on short notice, ordered to leave one threatened sector and race to another, sometimes covering in hours what would have taken heavier formations most of a day. At Noville, this mobility allowed Team Desaubry to absorb blows that might otherwise have shattered a slower force. When German pressure built on one flank, a pair of Hellcats could redeploy quickly through the town, arriving in time to stiffen the line, deliver a sudden, savage burst of fire, then slip away before counterfire could fix them. When infantry needed direct fire on a building or a gun position, an M18 could appear, deliver its 76mm argument, and be gone before artillery could range in. The 2nd Panzer Division, designed to exploit speed at the operational level, now found itself outpaced in miniature at the tactical and operational levels by a handful of American vehicles that simply moved faster point to point. Noville did not stop the bulge by itself, but the stand there, enabled in no small part by the race that got those Hellcats into position, played a critical role in slowing the German advance along one of its key axes, buying Bastogne the hours and days it needed to become the nut that refused to be cracked. When historians later traced German spearhead movements on maps, a pattern emerged. Again and again, the timetable slipped, not because German tanks couldn't win local fights, they often could, but because they could not reach those fights fast enough or exploit their victories rapidly enough in the face of American units that arrived, repositioned, and reappeared with unnerving speed. The M18 Hellcat, born out of a doctrine that treated speed as a weapon in a duel, had demonstrated in the Ardennes that speed was just as deadly as a tool of deployment. Get there first, and you choose the ground. Get there first, and you define the engagement. Get there first, and you force a powerful enemy to waste momentum, fuel, and precious time reacting instead of advancing. In the snow and ice of December 1944, as German tank commanders cursed frozen roads and unexpected American roadblocks, the lesson became impossible to ignore. Armour and firepower matter. But in a crisis, when everything depends on who reaches the crossroads, the bridge, or the village first, mobility can decide battles before the first shot is ever fired. By the time the shooting stopped in Europe, the numbers told a story that even the most stubborn traditionalist couldn't ignore. 526 enemy armoured vehicles claimed destroyed. 216 M18 Hellcats lost in combat. Roughly a 2.4 to 1 kill ratio overall. In specific battles like Arracourt, the disparity was even more brutal. Dozens of Panthers burned for the loss of only a handful of Hellcats. Those numbers didn't happen by accident. They were the compound interest of a single decision made years earlier, to stop trying to build a better Panther and instead build something the Panther wasn't designed to fight at all. The German approach to armoured warfare was evolutionary. Take the tank that worked in 1940 and keep scaling it up. More armour, bigger guns, more complex optics. Panzer III becomes Panzer IV. Panzer IV leads to Panther. Panther grows into Tiger and Tiger II, each new generation heavier, thicker, more specialized. On the proving grounds, that evolution made sense. Against static targets and predictable threats, more armour and firepower always look good. The American approach with the M18 was revolutionary. It started by asking a different question. Not, how do we survive being hit, but how do we avoid being hit in the first place? That single shift inverted the design priorities. Armour dropped to the bottom of the list. Mobility jumped to the top. Firepower and crew efficiency filled the middle. The result was a machine that broke the mental model German tankers had been trained to rely on. They knew how to fight Shermans. They knew how to fight Churchills and T-34s. They did not know how to fight something that refused to play by the same rules. The M18's speed meant that traditional concepts like front armour and hull down became less relevant. Hellcats turned fights into three-dimensional problems of time and angle, not just range and penetration. They appeared where side armor was exposed, delivered their salvo, and disappeared before heavy turrets could track them. This wasn't bravery compensating for inferior equipment. It was doctrine plus design producing engagements where the enemy's strengths were consistently bypassed and their weaknesses consistently exploited. After the war, when veterans on both sides began to talk more freely, a pattern emerged in their memories. American Hellcat crews spoke of their vehicle with affection and respect, acknowledging its fragility but praising its reliability and responsiveness. They remembered the feeling of the engine digging in and the landscape blurring past, the sense that if they were smart and quick, they could pick when and where to risk a shot. German Panzer crews remembered something else. Asked decades later which American armored vehicle they feared most, many did not pick the heaviest tank or the largest gun. They pointed to the M18 Hellcat. Not because it could out-punch a Tiger head-on, it couldn't, but because it turned every open field into a place where they no longer controlled the pace of the fight. The hunter's confidence they had carried from the early war years was shaken by a machine that hunted differently. The Hellcat was, in many ways, ahead of its time. Modern main battle tanks are not thin-skinned hot rods. They are heavily armored, enormously powerful machines. But look closely at something like the M1 Abrams, and you can see the philosophical echo of the M18 in its bones. The Abrams is not just a rolling bunker with a big gun. It is built around the idea that mobility and firepower together, delivered at speed with excellent situational awareness, are what keep a crew alive. Gas turbine power pack for rapid acceleration, suspension designed to keep the gun stable at high speed over broken ground, advanced fire control that allows crews to shoot on the move, turning transit time into firing time. A focus on being able to get to decisive points on the battlefield quickly, engage accurately, and reposition before the enemy can adapt. Strip away the layers of composite armor and electronics, and the logic feels familiar. Don't just survive hits. Make the enemy's best shot arrive a half-second too late, or a few meters off target, because you were already somewhere else. That is the M18's DNA, not in steel thickness, but in priorities. The legacy of the Hellcat is also doctrinal. Armies that studied its performance came away with hard lessons about adaptability. The Germans had pursued perfection along a single axis. The Americans, pressed by logistics, geography, and time, chose to bend the axis itself. Instead of taking an existing concept to its extreme, they introduced a new one, a dedicated, high-speed, armored fighting vehicle, built around the idea of never standing still in the first place. In hindsight, that kind of innovation feels obvious. At the time, it was a gamble, one that could easily have failed if commanders had insisted on using the M18 as just another tank, or if industrial capacity hadn't matched the concept. But it did work, and in doing so, it quietly undercut a myth that had dominated armored warfare since the first clanking Mark I rolled across a trench, that the side with the thickest armor and biggest gun automatically sets the terms of the engagement. The last image to hold in mind isn't a table of statistics, though those numbers matter. It's something simpler and more symbolic. A wide French field somewhere in 1944. On one side, a Tiger, or a Panther, lumbering forward, 70 tons of steel, armor sloped and bolted and welded with all the care German industry can still muster. On the other, a lean, open-topped Hellcat, 20 tons of thin plate wrapped around a screaming radial engine. A signal goes out. Both drivers push their machines. The heavy tank surges, then settles into its best pace. Suspension heaving, transmission complaining. The Hellcat leaps, tracks biting into the soil, speed building until the cold air tears at the crew's faces. Within seconds, the distance between them isn't just physical, it's conceptual. One machine embodies everything armies believed about armor for 30 years. The other represents a new idea, that agility, information, and the ability to adapt faster than your enemy can turn their turret may matter more than how thick your front plate is. On that field, the Hellcat doesn't need to destroy the Tiger to prove its point. All it has to do is what it was built to do: race past. Choose the angle, decide when, where, and whether the fight happens at all. In war, as in technology, real revolutions rarely announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive as abrupt, uncomfortable moments when old certainties fail and something lighter, faster, and more flexible slips into the space they leave behind. The M18 Hellcat was one of those moments. It didn't just kill armor. It killed the assumption that armor alone would always rule the battlefield, and changed the rules of the game for everyone who came after. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If you want more long-form, fact-driven World War II documentaries in this style, make sure to subscribe to the Iron Witness channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode.